Hi guys, I'm Nicola McKenzie, founder and mortgage advisor here at Dunham McCarthy Mortgages. And in today's video, I'm going to be giving you important things and pitfalls that you should be aware of if you are considering using the shared ownership scheme to purchase a property. So to find out more, stay tuned. Now, shared ownership scheme can be advantageous and a great way of getting onto or moving along the property ladder. However, as with everything, there can be pitfalls, and being aware of them can save you both time and money, hence why I've put this video together. Now, let me start by just giving a brief summary of how shared ownership works. Now, you will buy a share of your property or your home, and that usually can be anything from 25% to 75%, and you would pay a mortgage lender for the amount that you've borrowed. The remaining percentage share you would then pay rent on. So in turn, this means that you'll usually have a smaller deposit than if you were to purchase the entirety of the property, and you would have, like I say, a mortgage on the percentage share that you buy. Now, you can over time buy more shares in your home in future, working towards owning the property outright. Now, under the scheme, the cost of home ownership is made more affordable because you can start by, as I said, buying as little as a 25% share in a property, and your deposit can be as little as 5% of that share rather than of the whole value of the property. Now, bear in mind that properties are usually leasehold when you're purchasing shared ownership, and therefore you also have to take into account usually monthly service charges as well as ground rents. Now, there is also eligibility criteria that you have to meet in order to be eligible to use the scheme. I'm not going to go into that today's video. Really, I just want to focus on the pitfalls. I should also just point out, often people commonly ask me what my thoughts are on shared ownership. Do I think it's good? Do I think it's bad? Well, again, I'm not really here to express my opinions on shared ownership in today's video. But in summary, what I would say is that I think it's neither good nor bad. What I do think is that it's there to suit certain situations. In the same way that if you were buying a property outright, you could make a good investment, or similarly, you could make a bad one. And I feel that the same applies to shared ownership. So now let's look at some of the main pitfalls of the scheme. Now, the first thing to be aware of is that buying a property under a shared ownership scheme is going to limit the alterations that you'll be able to make to that property, and also how you can use the property. So regardless of how much the property you own, whether it's 25% or 75%, you will most likely be restricted by the extent of alterations that you can do. Even decorating, in some cases, depending on the terms of your lease, can be limited. Now, there is also a high likelihood that there are going to be restrictions that will apply to you on whether or not you can rent the property out. In a majority of cases, subletting is not allowed. So that is something to be aware of. Now, the next pitfall that I'm going to explain is staircasing and the fees associated with staircasing. So staircasing, if you don't know, is when you acquire additional shares in the property. Now, often by staircasing, you will have mortgage fees to pay and valuation fees, and you will also need to involve a solicitor. So these costs can rack up. I mean, you know, a valuation is going to cost you best part of £200 to £300. Solicitor costs are also going to set you back hundreds of pounds. Now, the same applies when you come to remortgage. So when you have a shared ownership property, let's say you are in a 2-year fixed rate deal. Initially, that deal comes to an end and you decide to change lenders. If you stay with the same lender, often the fees can be, you know, a lot lower in that scenario. But if you're changing lenders, then again, a valuation would be required, likely mortgage arrangement fees and other costs. And you would also need to involve a solicitor in that process. Now, finally, whether you are staircasing, swapping lenders, or both, again, you just need to be aware of the costs involved with that. Now next, let's look at property sale complications. So one of the things you have to be aware of is that the housing association, if you've purchased the shared ownership from a housing association, usually will have first refusal on whether to purchase your property, should you wish to move and sell the property. Now this is the case even if you have staircased and you own the full 100% value of the property in many cases. Now this can cause delays since the housing association will be looking for a buyer looking for the same help and support under a shared ownership scheme as you initially were when you acquired the property. So naturally there's a smaller pool of buyers available. However, usually after a set amount of time you can then appoint your own estate agent and selling agent. So usually it will only be first refusal by the housing association, and if they fail to sell it within a set time period, you can then go towards the open market. But it's something to be aware of. Now the next thing to consider is that you will have building repair and maintenance charges. So if, let's say, the housing association own the building that you live in, they may provide support for things like repairs and maintenance known as service charges. Now this is something that's not necessarily unique to shared ownership. If you were purchasing a flat, then you would have the same implication to consider as well. But where the building is owned by an independent company, you will almost certainly have to pay towards the ongoing maintenance, such as roof repairs, repairs to communal areas, etc. So again, it's just something to factor into your ongoing costs and your affordability. Now, the next point to consider is that ground rents can often escalate. And sometimes the escalation of the ground rent is something that can be, I guess you could say, unreasonable. Now, again, ground rent is something that's not unique to shared ownership properties. You would often have ground rent to pay if you were purchasing a flat, because a flat is also likely to be leasehold. Now, escalating ground rent is a big one and can be one of the main factors that can sometimes give shared ownership a bad name, I think. So what I would say here is that you need to just make sure that you're doing your due diligence before committing to a shared ownership property. Simply just check through the lease terms. And if you're not confident on checking through the lease terms, then of course that is what your solicitor or conveyancer should be there to help support you to do. Now, ground rent is the money that a leaseholder, so the person buying the property, would pay to the freeholder to occupy the land that their property is built upon. Now, this may be paid directly to the freeholder or to a block management company. So I think the point I'm making here, guys, is that if you're considering purchasing any leasehold property, whether it's shared ownership or an apartment or a flat, just make sure to check out the ground rent and service charge terms before proceeding. Because in some instances, it's not been unknown that there can be clauses written into a lease that means that costs can even double in some cases every 10 or 15 years. So a ground rent that starts at £250 today, so £250 per year, it sounds reasonable, but if in the clause in the lease it says that that's going to double every 10 years, then 60 years from now you could be paying a whopping £16,000 per year. And even with the cost of living and salaries increasing, I still think it's fair to say that that would probably be quite an expense. Now, it's also a point worth mentioning, again, from a mortgage perspective, because being a mortgage broker, mortgage advisor, this is the angle that often we're analysing things from. Depending on how the ground rent works and how it's stipulated in the lease, then a mortgage lender could decline your application if they see the lease charges as unreasonable. So, for example, many lenders will insist that the ground rent is a maximum of £250 per year, or 0.1% of the purchase price of the property, whichever is the higher figure. And many lenders will not accept properties where the ground rent is, as the example I gave earlier, going to double over time. Now, even if you did find a lender to agree to a doubling ground rent, again, should you purchase that property? Well, that's the questionable part about this, because are you then going to find a buyer that's willing to accept such terms as part of the lease? So something to be aware of, something to check with your solicitor and your conveyancer. Now, expanding on the topic of leases, the next pitfall to be aware of is that some leases can have other restrictions outside of things like the ground rent and the service charges. Now, some leases are known to contain what's called a restrictive covenant. Now, this can restrict what can be done to the property or the land it's built on, or restrict how much it can be sold for in the future, or even who it can be sold to in the future. Whatever the covenant may be, it's important that you are aware of them early on, because these things can impact on the saleability of the property in future and impact you ultimately as the buyer. Again, your conveyancer or solicitor should help you to check these things out. But one point I would just mention is that it's probably worth getting your solicitor to check over these things early on in the process, because if you let the process just run naturally, most solicitors wouldn't check this until quite late in the process. And of course, at that point, you may have already paid certain fees, etc., that you may not get back if it turns out that you don't like the terms of the lease. And depending on what covenants are in the lease, it can also restrict or impact on the mortgage lender's decision as to whether or not they're even going to lend you the funds. So it's just something to be aware of. Now, the next pitfall that I'm going to cover off is falling into negative equity. Now, negative equity, guys, again, you need to understand this is something that's not unique just to shared ownership properties. Any property, technically speaking, could fall into negative equity. But in many situations, shared ownership schemes are based on new properties. And with this being the case, it's possible that with most new homes, the original price, or in many cases, the original price of new homes can be a little overinflated. Because most new homes, let's face it, will come at a premium in the same way that a new car would come at a premium. You know, you pay a little bit of a premium in most cases for being the first person to drive that car, or in this case, the first person to live in that property. Now, with this in mind, if you were deciding to staircase, so buy additional shares in the property, that could see you tip the balance into negative equity, where basically you owe more than the property is actually worth. So again, it's just important to make sure that you're making a sound investment, and you know, that will limit the risk of you falling into negative equity. It's also worth me just mentioning on that point, when you're initially considering shared ownership, I think it's really important that you have a clear goal on what your objectives are and what your long-term aims are. So for example, is this home just a stepping stone, or is it more of a forever residence? The longer you're aiming to own the property, then negative equity isn't going to impact on you as much as if you're looking to buy the property and sell it on quite quickly. Now, finally, I'm just going to point out that shared ownership schemes mean that the number of mortgage lenders willing to offer such mortgages will be restricted. Now, again, this is typical, not just unique to shared ownership. This is something that applies to the Help to Buy scheme and many schemes for that matter. Not every bank is going to accept that particular scenario. Now, whilst I would say that a lot of high street lenders will consider shared ownership, but ultimately you are going to find more lenders available if you are not purchasing using a shared ownership scheme. And it's also worth me mentioning that you still have to undergo affordability tests with the lender in the same way that you would with a traditional mortgage. It's also worth me pointing out that if the costs of the rent and the mortgage generally exceed more than 45% of your overall income, then you're probably going to struggle to pass affordability checks for shared ownership schemes. So just something to be aware of. But if you're unsure on affordability or anything else for that matter, but shared ownership is still something that you want to consider, then again, get in touch and we can help you to assess your eligibility and affordability for the scheme. Now, in summary, I would say that shared ownership is a scheme that does manage to benefit many people. And I think I made this point earlier on, but like any property investment, it can sometimes be a great investment. It can sometimes end up being a nightmare. This is not just for shared ownership properties, but properties in general. And it's about making sure that you get the right level of expertise and advice, and do your due diligence and research. Now, certainly where it comes to the mortgage aspect of things, that's where we will help you do your due diligence and advise you on what's best. So make sure that you get in touch, head over to our website and book in dm.mortgage for a free of charge appointment, and we can help you, certainly guide you through the mortgage aspect of the process if you are considering shared ownership schemes. But like I say, I think that shared ownership has its time and its place, and as long as you're going into it with your eyes wide open and you've done your due diligence on the particular property you're looking at purchasing, then it can be advantageous for many people. So head over to our website and book in dm.mortgage if you're considering shared ownership or any other type of property ownership for that matter, and we can certainly help give you advice on your mortgage options. Of course, if today's video has been useful and you've enjoyed it, make sure that you give it a like and make sure that you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so that you never miss a future upload. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, bye.